Great, thank you for having us. And I'm joined by Abria Armstrong, who's our head of communications, who is also going to walk us through some of the stuff and how that relates with her work and some of her experiences when we get into some of the case studies and specifics. I bear with me because I think Mia, it said you took over my camera, so hopefully that helps me not to mess this up too badly. I will
Okay.
do my darndest to.
And then let me know if you can control back. Okay.
I think it's okay. Is that, I mean, I'm just going to share this screen and we'll see how that goes. Okay. Hopefully, can you see that, somebody? All right, I see some nods. So we're Activist. Thank you all for having us here. We use this picture a lot, I think, because I think it's important to get at just how much there's a lot of externalized risk, and I don't think people necessarily always get that with bonds. I will say personally, in my personal life, when I try to talk to my friends or family about bonds, their eyes kind of glaze over. But it can have very serious and material impacts, negative and positive, for either neglecting folks through how you're financing those bonds, or deeply investing in community, which is obviously what we'd like to see. So that is why we've got that. Hopefully the bar is not in the middle of the screen, right? That's just on mine. Okay, cool. So we did oops, sorry. And someone is there. Okay, cool. We did a quick little intro, but yes, I'm a senior fellow with Activest. I lead up a lot of our research along with Abria, who takes some of the nerdy things I do in Excel and makes them translatable to the public. But yeah, we work together a lot on kind of doing some of this research, going to either deep into cities to really understand how a lot of these negative practices and outcomes for Black and Brown residents are funded through municipal finance, and really how that creates risk for the residents and for the city, and trying to move towards change in those areas. And we'll get a little bit more into detail on that. Activist. So Activist, I'm glad you said earlier that this is a storytelling environment. We started in about 2016. It started with our co-founder, Ryan Bowers. He went down to Ferguson. He was invited down to Ferguson in the wake of Mike Brown's murder, and was talking to people and looking into trying to get a better understanding of the total kind of environment in Ferguson. And one of the things that continuously came up was this obviously excessive policing, which is, you know, the story that we that kind of unfolded and that we learned more about in the months that followed. But an interesting part of that, a really problematic part of that, was that the city was basically filling this kind of hole in their budget that they created through a number of ways, partially through giving significant tax breaks to one particular company there. But they were filling this hole in their budget by taxation through citation against the predominantly Black population there, enforced by the majority white police department. So they're basically going around and giving, you know, excessive and arbitrary fines, fees, increasing interactions with police, and obviously the potential for a really violent, extremely violent, all of those are violent, but extremely violent interaction with the police, as what we saw with Mike Brown, and then obviously the subsequent protests after that. And the prevailing idea, even coming from the DOJ at the time, was that this was an exception. Oh, looks like James has joined. Was that this was an exception to the rule, and in fact, cities around the United States weren't doing this. And so we did kind of a quick scan of a couple thousand cities, and it was immediately evident that they were not an outlier. In fact, a number of cities and counties use this strategy of basically extracting revenue through violent police interactions and the subsequent tickets and fines for that, to shore up their budget. And so we kind of pulled on that thread, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the other ways that shows up. But that was kind of the genesis of Activest, was looking at how these municipal budgets oftentimes for Black, brown, and oppressed people are like perpetuating, and the money is literally funding either the extraction of wealth, or it's divesting from these communities and creating these outcomes for residents. And very little of it is being tracked, at least from this very specific kind of municipal finance perspective. In the case of Ferguson, just to stay with that for a second more, in the case of Ferguson, this was not showing up anywhere. You have rating agencies that would review, how they're doing, and give a different rating based on how financially stable basically they assume they were. And none of that was showing up on the radar for Ferguson, and as is the case for many cities. So anyways, officially we blend economic modeling, financial analysis, and social policy research to examine this in municipal finance and municipal budgets. But I just wanted to share that kind of origin story, and it's a great case study of just really how we see this kind of play out in cities today. And I am just, okay. So we do this in a couple of different ways. I'm going to go quickly through this because we've got some more interesting stuff just in the details, but we work with bondholders, the folks who actually own this debt. In the equities market, if you've seen lately, we've seen a lot more pushback and people acting as activist investors with companies like Amazon, lots of big companies, and proposing different things that if they can get enough votes behind, that the company will have to do. That doesn't exist in the municipal debt world or in the debt world generally. And so that's something we're trying to foster. We also just generally create tools that help people to be able to measure and to see this. So it's a framework, and it's also being able to quantify that. And then developing strategies so that investors who are more socially minded and aligned can actually be supporting the positive things that are happening in cities to kind of counter some of this. Let's see here. So many of you have probably voted on or heard about different bonds in the communities you're in. Basically, it's an IOU for the government. These, I don't want to jump ahead, but there's, I was talking a little bit about the bondholders. So basically the city can issue a couple different kinds of bonds. They'll either issue a general obligation bond, and that is just backed by their ability to tax the residents. And I'm sorry, I was just noticing the chat. So can the slides be made smaller? Is it cutting off at one point? Sorry, I see your comment, Reverend Dr. C&B. And I don't actually know how to make them smaller. Is that cutting off for other people on your screen? It's not too bad. Okay, we can share these afterwards if that helps. Okay, cool. You can see it. Sorry about that. And then, sorry, someone else had a question about how does your work show up in the ratings of the bonds? The short answer is initially we thought let's influence the rating agencies. And so if we just share this data, they'll be responsive. That wasn't the case. Maybe we were a little naive then, but it was like, okay, there's a lot of power in what the rating agencies do. So, it wasn't entirely naive. It was kind of, doing a little power mapping and trying to figure out who can influence this. They're too slow moving, I'll say. And so I don't know if we have it in here, but what we've done is we've just started publishing our own research on this. We'll throw some in the chat and stuff, but we started publishing our own research. And then in the last year and a half, we actually partnered with a firm to actually start creating products that are like, you know what, we have our own assessment. You may say, X county, particularly when it's Black and brown communities, we specifically focus more on Black communities. But let's say with like Jackson, Flint, places like that, and then places people that aren't really on folks' radar in terms of what's going on with them socially and environmentally in many of those cases. But we went ahead and said, we're going to do this ourselves. We've got a framework, we've got an assessment, and we're going to start investing in those cities now because the rating agencies are slow. Okay, let me see really quickly if I can see the rest of this. Oh, thank you, Abria. Okay, cool. And please feel free to keep the chat active. I don't want to just yak on and miss that. So feel free to interrupt there. So in short, the municipal bonds can go to fund a number of things. We're talking schools, roads. Regularly, they fund airports. A lot of times, universities are able to issue those. They might do a joint one with the city, or the city issues it. But the university is ultimately the ones using that. There's interesting things around that, and then obviously the water, sewer, different transportation. So basically a lot of things that you would use, services that you'd use in a city or in a municipality. Let's see here. This is to give you an idea of it. I think we're up to 4 trillion now. So big. Just about every medium, even small sized counties, cities, communities, townships will issue bonds for the range of things that I listed previously. You can see obviously some of the more densely populated states obviously have more, but in short, this is just to share. It's a fairly common tool that a lot of folks use. So this is kind of where it gets interesting. Is who buys these, and also there's a term that this author he's now out of Stanford, Destin Jenkins, uses, bondholder supremacy. You nodded. I'm not sure if he came already or if he's maybe going to speak to y'all at some point. Okay. So Destin uses that term, and we like to borrow from that. We work with him a lot. But really, when you talk about what power these people have, I'm sorry, you've got some list of the folks who buy that: families, different banks, different institutions. Lots of folks will buy municipal bonds for the tax benefits, because if you buy a municipal bond issued in your state, you get some tax break from that. That was sort of by design to help incentivize people to help provide cheap or low interest debt to cities and other government entities. Okay, so back to the bondholder supremacy. Sorry, I'm trying to keep myself on track here. Basically, what he means when he's talking about that is that cities will contort themselves, their budgets, how they spend and how they prioritize, to really elevate the folks who hold their debt and prioritize them oftentimes over the residents. And so what you'll see in cities that either don't have a lot of general revenue coming in through taxes, so if they don't have a particularly high income base to draw from, if we're experiencing some kind of economic downturn, there's a couple other instances. But what they'll do is they will prioritize and start implementing austerity measures. So cutting a lot of the services that I imagine, and programs and investments that a lot of us on here care about and can see the benefit of, and instead prioritize having enough money on hand to pay back their bondholders, having a financial statement that really looks healthy to the bondholders, over investing in residents. And that's probably, there's a lot of other things here, but that's probably the biggest issue with that dynamic, is the people that hold the debt probably have the most power, as opposed to, and the city feels beholden to them more so than the residents oftentimes. That just gives you a quick idea of kind of where the funds, or where the debt kind of ends up. And I will say, even though you can see it's kind of skewed towards households, usually that's households, but it may be held through or organized through some kind of bank holding. You've also got mutual funds and stuff, but I think the majority of, although they are the majority holders of that, I think the banks and stuff really have the most say and influence in this kind of bondholder supremacy. Most households aren't super involved or concerned with those holdings. Small thing on this, because I think there's a possibility with bonds to have a positive impact, no matter if their designation is something, like a social impact bond or an ESG bond, sustainable bond. We've got all the different names here. However, people, and I think there's value in distinguishing these two. I think there's marketing, it signals to it, that's fine. But I think originally the bonds were supposed to be for the public good. We've seen that that's not fully the case. And so I think somewhat in response to that, we've just seen a proliferation of these so-called green or impact bonds over the years. And I think this number has really gone up, but we were having trouble finding the updated report. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Abria now, and I can keep sharing Abria if that's helpful. You just
That'd
let
be
me know when
perfect,
to
Chelsea.
advance. Great.
Yeah, thank you. And so Chelsea has done a great job at really teeing up some of the things that rating agencies, for example, haven't taken into account for municipalities, but then also some of the things that cities are doing that those rating agencies aren't taking into account. So now we're going to dig a little deeper into what some of those things are and even some numbers behind those. Great. And this is a bit of a level setting slide because we want to make sure that we are all on the same page in terms of as we're talking about credit ratings and that sort of thing. So for example, just as people have credit scores, cities have credit ratings, and there are different factors that come in that play into that. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little more about what some of those are. And a good rating is viewed as minimal risk, and and you're able to get things at a lower premium, or excuse me, a lower interest rate, just the same way that you would as an individual consumer, having more easier access to capital, those sorts of things. And it was particularly when we're talking about Black and Brown communities, is that access to capital and the price they're paying for that capital that really makes a difference here. And so now we're going to talk about what some of those factors are and that go into credit rating and what is missing. And so you'll see things like tax base and for example, one of the areas for a city like Louisville that we'll talk about that rating agencies are missing is essentially if you want to look at the amount of income tax revenue that a municipality may be able to intake, and acknowledging that because you haven't properly educated, properly empowered a certain populace, particularly Black and Brown communities, how much income tax are you losing, is foregone as a result of that. And then additionally, what are, if we're looking at some things like predatory revenues or even tax abatements, like what are some of the ways that cities are spending money or not bringing in money that are affecting populations of color? And so next slide, please, Chelsea. And so here are a few headlines to demonstrate what some of that looks like in actuality. So whether it is, so if we're looking in this bottom right corner, for example, whether it is the settlements that police brutality settlements are costing, and how cities are turning or basically having to put this cost onto the taxpayers because this is a sort of public burden, if you will, and understanding how, because of police decisions as well as governance decisions, these extra expenditures are happening. And so we can even just simply think about where else could that $38.2 million have gone to better communities. And in the top left corner, we're looking at a FLINT headline. FLINT is a great example of what happens when poor governance as it relates to infrastructure and water utilities, when poor governance is executed, right? And so as a result of the Flint water crisis, there have been water settlements. And if you go to the link that I dropped in the chat, you'll be able to find our Flint water settlement report to really look at the numbers. And again, who is paying for all of this? And this really comes down to the taxpayers and the burden that many disenfranchised communities are having to bear, not only from the sense of, let's say, over policing and the sort of nuisance tickets and you're being too loud and you're loitering. And Louisville is a great example of what that looks like in terms of really targeting a population. So bearing the burden of that sort of lifestyle impairment, if you will, but then also thinking about rate covenants for water utilities and how in certain places they will put the burden of water utility maintenance onto consumers and are really just saddling a lot of disenfranchised communities with that cost versus using, for example, an ad valorem tax structure, which disperses the cost of such maintenance across the community. Next slide, please, Chelsea. And so here is an example of what some of the sort of numbers look like that sort of raise eyebrows, if you will. And so tax abatements is one area where, if an organization like Amazon, for example, wants to move into your community, what sort of incentives are local governments giving to these organizations, these corporations, in order for them to move in? And what is the tax loss, the revenue loss for the municipality as a result of those giveaways? And we do have best practices. We do have best practices in terms of like how budgets should look. But what we really want to call out as we think about a fiscal justice budget analysis is this idea that the amount of tax abatements that municipalities are giving to corporations in particular typically is not accounted for in terms of rating downgrades, for example, typically not accounted for by the rating agencies. And we at Activest believe that it should. And another example of this is fines and fees. And so if we're talking about extractive revenues and governance decisions and best and practices that these municipalities are partaking in, what we're finding is that municipalities are, in this is phrased as generate, but we could also phrase as extracting $7.2 billion annually through fines and fees. So fines and fees come in the form and forfeiture, civil forfeiture. So whether police have raided your house and taken things, this is happened to Breonna Taylor. Not only was her life taken, but there was also some cash that was taken as well. Fees in terms of if you are on probation, for example, and the fees that you're paying for drug testing or for ankle monitoring. There's a case in Alabama is one of the sort of worst offenders of this. And fines, we talked about, I mentioned, like, for example, nuisance tickets of just being too loud, right, on the corner or loitering, and just finding those sort of little micro ways, but also very impactful ways that municipalities are extracting from these communities, and really looking at that in comparison to the percent of general fund revenue. And so when it gets above what we're naming at 5%, we find that to be to sort of raise eyebrows in terms of this is a fiscal injustice, and noting rather the extractive tendencies that the municipality has, particularly on its Black citizens, and how those rating agencies are, again, not taking this into account. And so now Chelsea is going to share with you a little deeper on what some of this looks like in practice.
Thanks, Abria. And just hopefully we made that connection clear, but maybe I'll just so when we're talking about the ways that a city some of the what we call kind of like fiscal justice practices that they're having really negative outcomes. So whether it's shoring up revenues through extraction, like Abria was talking about, or giving away revenues to corporations and divesting from communities at the other hand, that is all connected to the municipal finance, I guess, or to the municipal bonds that they use to fund all of these things, and then also how they pay them back. And I think there's been lots of organizing, obviously, around the different programs they do or don't fund. But I think this piece of where they get access to capital markets and to debt. And I saw, so Dustin already talked to you, so probably already gave a much better explanation of this, but I think that piece is really, there's an opportunity there to kind of push on that. And frankly, like mess with their money, because I think we're seeing like there's access to relatively cheap capital because the interest is supposedly in the public good. And the reality is just that it isn't. So some examples of that. We did a piece, I think Abria shared that on the Flint settlement bond, similarly to the settlement in Louisville and all of the kind of police justice or police injustice settlements. We're not against the settlement. The issue really is with how this is being paid, how the city, it's oftentimes not tied. In the case of Flint, it was the state paying this out, but it's oftentimes insufficient funds. And I don't think there's any amount when you have loved ones who are severely harmed or killed by this. So it's definitely insufficient financially, but there's also, there's very rarely any commitment to any change in action that wouldn't just create the same outcome. And so I don't know if we have it in there, but one bit of work we did was with Chicago. They would budget every year for how much they plan to set to have to actually pay out in police settlements and blow past that number by millions every year. And there was never any change in behavior. And so it's accountability for that. And then it's also saying that this is now, as Abria said, this is now the burden of all of the residents, all of the citizens. And once again, nothing changed. And so I think it's really getting at what materially needs to change and creating some actual consequence for these really harmful, actions. And in fact, you shouldn't be able to just easily go and raise debt to cover this. Pardon me, sorry, I'm getting my allergies here. So that's a bit of what we talked about with Flint. We sort of work in a way, and I guess I didn't say this at the top, we started initially, and kind of like that story I told of Ryan down in Ferguson, we start with meeting with communities and learning from folks on the ground, because there's the census report, there's other reports that people put out, there's your comprehensive annual financial report or the audited financials for a city. All of those have a lag, and all of them lack the on the ground nuance that I think organizers and folks in the community have. And so that tends to be where we start and how we really get the sense that something is off here, because oftentimes it isn't reflected, as we said, in the credit rating agencies and stuff, is listening to folks on the ground, looking at the outcomes for residents, hearing what they're saying. We had folks in Louisville who were just going door to door and looking at displacement that way long before the census would ever track that. And then from there, it's really building up the research around that to help, give back to folks. Oh, looks like someone else is joining, to share with the community and with investors. And then to the extent that we can rally to get the current bondholders to actually push for change from their side of things, where they do hold a lot of power. We push for that. If it's a new bond, and we can push for just not issuing it at all and kind of protesting that outright, that's another avenue. I just want to show that because I'm not sure we have all of those there. Oh yeah, bondholder engagement. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Anywho, so with the bondholder engagement, I spoke a little bit about this earlier, but we basically provide them with the information, and this can happen in a couple of ways. So there's the maybe softer approach, where we're reaching out to the bondholders and saying, did you know that these are some of the negative impacts? It's creating risk for your investment. These are opportunities and ways that the community is asking for the city to be engaged and be pushed towards action that will have better outcomes for residents, whether it's divesting from excessive policing, whether it's really investing in education, whether it's thinking more about stabilizing residents in place before we're doing all this development, whether it's looking at universities and other entities in your city that are exempt from paying taxes, and really examining more, more intently how a pilot program or payment in lieu of taxes like Boston has, how that program may or may not be actually shoring up enough revenue for the city, and folks may not actually be paying their fair share. So all of those things are ways and things that we highlight, and we usually do that in the form of a letter, in addition to sharing this information publicly sometimes. And then sometimes it's a much more public campaign, and folks have the opportunity to actually say, and shame a little bit these folks who are funding this and haven't been responsive to that. And the method is really a public letter, a public, sharing of the data, and then working with partners on the ground who are engaging in a more direct way, participatory budgeting, different things like that. So that's kind of how we see bondholder engagement, and really trying to use the fact that there is a lot of power located there, and push on that for change. So yeah, I guess we have a little bit of time. We only have like 5 minutes. Is that right, Nia? Okay, so we can talk about this if that's interesting in the chat about how this applies to Boston. But I see there's already some stuff in there. Oh, it's longer. It's a longer chat than I thought. Oh no, that is. Thank you, Abria. You're answering something. So there may not be any other questions there. Apologies. So I'll just leave it on that and open it up for questions. We won't dig deep into the city because we only have 5 minutes, but yeah, start there.
Hi, actually, I would like to hear what you have for the city of Boston.
All right.
Because I think that munis are a very interesting instrument, right? The budget, the city needs money.
Mm-hmm.
Muni bonds provide dollars. I think you're absolutely right. There's a lack of transparency unless you're buying those munis. And sometimes you don't know because most people, if they have a 401k, you have munis in your bond in your
Absolutely.
401k. So people are caught between and betwixt because you need your muni bonds to be real investments but we don't really know what's going in there. So I'm kind of curious to know, let's talk about Boston. What is your research? What is your recommendation? And then, and particularly as you were talking about the investors prioritized over the investments in the residents, can you
Mm-hmm.
parse that out a little bit to talk about that and how that should be flipped?
Yep, and I will do that in 2 or 3 minutes. No, I'll do my best. So I'll tell you where we tend to start. So we start with folks on the ground talking to that too. When we do our financial research, we pull the comprehensive annual financial report. And I think that's really helpful in comparison to the budget. And I can grab that and throw that in the chat at the end. But it's the statement of what actually happened. And it's a little dry. I'll admit, as the financial documents, and they're all kind of that way, but I think it helps you to parse out where the city actually ended up spending its money. And so in the case of Boston, I believe it was, so education was the highest category. Public safety was the second highest, but it was about 6 or 7 times higher than, I think you call it like the public good. I've got it just here. And the general public works, apologies. And then it was about 5 times higher than the general government. I would say we see that pretty commonly in cities, unfortunately, that prioritization on public safety. And then the second layer is kind of digging into that and what's going on there. I think another thing I mentioned was the payment in lieu of taxes pilots. Obviously, in a city that has as many nonprofit institutions that don't pay taxes, but also, and so not just the universities, but and the other entities, but obviously that's a way to draw in big corporations. That is a way to draw in development, condos and things like that. Oftentimes you will get, or the city will offer abatements to incentivize that, and that will get passed on. Meaning that the newer residents who are coming into these either
Right.
flipped home, right? Okay.
The
Yeah.
argument of the city is going to be, we need these jobs, right? And
Right.
so if Amazon brings 1,000 jobs and we
Sure.
tax them for X amount, do you show them the equation that that is actually a loss?
Yeah, because usually what it takes is giving away a ton of revenue. They oftentimes have development-driven policing, so they're investing even more into policing to however they want to. I think they think of it as kind of like making these areas ready for business, and so that's a lot of policing of people loitering and things like that. And then you have to house them overnight in jail. That's all costly, and so we add all of that up. I will say, as a resource, the folks, I think we had their logo on one of those pages, but the folks at Good Jobs First have particularly gone in on Amazon that have a really great analysis. And they're something called community. They have community agreements. I haven't seen any, and you'd be hard pressed to find on their website, but the framework of what it should and could look like if a community was saying, fine, if you're going to give away X tax revenue dollars, we need to have jobs that pay decently, that employ locally, that invest in the community, and the balance of how much we're giving away to how much we're getting needs to look a lot different. Right now, it's giving away a lot, and we're getting low paying jobs, no benefits, and in the case of Amazon, they union investing, people are dying on the job. I mean, it's just terrible. And that's so yeah, that is one resource for folks that are pushing back on that. Sorry, I don't know our time. I don't know how strict that is. I don't want to keep rambling because I get excited about this.
We started a little late, and I'm just looking around to see if there are other team members. I see one so far.
Oh, because
so
you have, yes.
maybe do 5 more minutes, and I do see a couple of comment in the chat. So
Oh,
Liz
you're right.
Curry, a little further up, said, I'm also wondering about environmental injustice and climate crisis events that have the worst impacts on Black communities due to the city's lack of investment in resilient infrastructure. Is there a way to tie racial justice finance to green rating?
Yeah, so unfortunately, what we've seen is not as much of the community that is really doing green and ESG bonds, really making that link. I think one of the biggest bonds out there is the DC water bond. And you'll remember 10, 15 years ago, DC had lead levels that were even higher than Flint's and had an extreme water crisis. And this was going on when DC was still a much Blacker city than it is today. And then I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago when the DC water project happened. That was all about cleaning up the water and also managing wastewater. And it's hard pressed to find anything in there that linked that. So I would say, unfortunately, I'm not seeing a ton of that. I think what we've tried to do is center, I think, Black residents, and then from there talk about how these environmental injustices impact them. One way we do that is talking about like stranded assets, that idea of stranded assets, or with kind of, I think you can see it easily with like white flight out of a city, an asset and the tax base changing, and the residents that have kind of left or fled the city still relying on that for, in the case of like a water utility, for water, but not really contributing in the ways that they should. Through some of these rate mandates that Abria was talking about, to the actual maintenance of that. And then usually there's a move to take over that water, the water provider from the city that is now majority Black. So sorry, I gave bad examples. Usually we don't see that. My apologies. You were asking if you do see that. We try to make the connections of where people are missing that, I think, is what we try to do. Unfortunately, I don't see the funding addressing it as well as it should be. Look at the case of Jackson. Jackson got additional funding from ARPA to specific to its water issues. This was prior to this heightening of the crisis, because it's been an ongoing crisis around the water there, and the lack of investment from the state. And the state took the money, put that in a special fund, and then added extra restrictions to make it exceptionally difficult to get funding. And then there was obviously the subsequent 20 million that they received in lieu of this latest crisis, which is nothing near the billion or so that they need to really get their water system right. So the answer was no. And I just gave a bunch of examples of how that doesn't show up. I'm so sorry. I'll try to find some good examples next time.
No, that was great, Chelsea. And I think we'll end with this last question, which is a really interesting one from Andy, also in the chat. Is there a model where there's some kind of community-owned co-op or pool of bonds purchased by wealthy stakeholders like developers or large corporations, but then the assets are owned by community members who are at risk of being displaced by gentrification, as a way to create equity amongst those who haven't historically had access to the opportunity to build generational wealth through property ownership?
We should talk after. We should talk. We are so when Abria and I and our team like sit and dream, like I think that is something we're really trying to figure out right now. It looks like, are there at least bondholders who trust us, trust the data we're bringing forth from the communities, and will advocate in those interests? I think that's a step removed from really truly looking more at like community ownership of that, but that's the interim stage that we're kind of in right now. So I would love to see that, and we talk about it, and we talk about what mechanisms you could create for that, and what it would look like to really give those back, to have those more community owned. But right now we're also just trying to stop certain assets from being privatized. And yeah, so I love that idea, and I love that sentiment. I think that was you, Randy. I was trying to look at you, but we don't have that product yet, at least not at that scale. I know there are smaller entities that obviously fund co-ops and fund things like this, but not at this scale yet. Yeah.
And thank you, Chelsea. And Abria has just dropped both Chelsea's email address and Abria's email address in the chat. I figure, Randy, you probably want to continue conversation with them, connect with them. And I know Bethia has said she's interested in connecting with you all. So there's the contact information there to connect. And I'll turn it back over to you, Sierra.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much for attending our workshop tonight. Chelsea, Bria, thank you so much for the beautiful presentation. This ends our Ujima Wednesdays workshop for today. So we're gonna say goodbye to YouTube, and I'm going to end the recording.